Good morning.
Morning.
How is everyone?
Good.
Good, yeah? Okay, good. So I'm from Virginia, so it is about 1:15, and I've been up for about probably 7 hours so far, yeah. I set my alarm. I'm not really sure why I set my alarm. I didn't need it. I was up an hour and a half early. But it was a nice run by the water. So the morning session's good? Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about sort of the evolution of cyber warfare, specifically really looking at defense in depth, some of the constructs. We're going to close that. There we go. Thank you. Sort of some of the constructs, frameworks, controls, those kinds of things. Provoke some thought. Certainly want to have this be interactive. If there's, tell me I'm crazy, go pound sand. If you agree, would love for concurrence, questions, thoughts. Very quickly, a little bit about me. I've been with ForeScout 3.5 years as an engineer in our state and local education space, covering the southeastern United States, specifically sort of South Carolina down around through Mississippi. Recently taken on greater responsibility for the eastern half of the United States, and then coming out and getting the opportunity, being provided the opportunity to come out and speak events like this, sort of evangelize various topics, whether it be something specific to ForeScout or some industry type of a topic. So without further ado, so I've become had become a huge fan of iRobot. I don't know how many people had seen iRobot, but it's really kind of a awesome show. The realities of what Freddie Mercury's character, right? I get that? Freddie Mercury, Rami Malek. Okay. What Rami Malek's character sort of went through, has gone through, throughout the various scenes, the various aspects of the vulnerabilities and the hacks, and what they were ultimately able to sort of do and implement from a threat perspective, really sort of became very much an eye-opener for me, and one where I needed to kind of educate my daughters on some of the dangers, and my wife on some of the dangers of really what vulnerabilities exist, right? Obviously being a security practitioner with ForeScout, it's one of those things that is top of mind for me every day. So let's talk a little bit about some of the security challenges that sort of represent the landscape today. A diverse, expanding attack surface, right? So everybody in here, whether you are with a city, a county, an agency for a city or a county, a higher ed institution, a public school system, whatever the case may be, ultimately you've got some collection of these on the upper left-hand side, right? Whether it is cloud, whether it is mobile devices, whether it is IoT, whether there is operational technology, ultimately that the entirety of that potentially is an attack surface, right? So for our adversarial, for the adversaries that are out there, the fact that we have such a plethora of various device types and various points of potential attack that we need to try and protect ourselves and the environments and the citizens and the services we provide to those citizens. The market for those attacks is quite significant. Very strongly motivated and well-funded threat actors, whether they are from nation states or whether they are the 2 Iranian gentlemen who were indicted last year from the SamSam hacks. Anybody familiar with the SamSam outbreak? Any idea? Did you hear the numbers? How much money they made since 2015? Over $6 million. What was their average ransom demand? A little over $50,000, right? So their ransom they asked of the city of Atlanta back last March was $51,000 in Bitcoin. Guess how much the city of Atlanta has since paid to try and recover? And oh yeah, by the way, they're not fully recovered. I was there on site, so we can talk maybe over beer at lunch or later. But they have spent upwards of $20 million to try and recover, and not fully recovered, mind you, right? So ultimately, the amount of damage that organizations can, these threat actors, these adversaries are able to implement becomes significant, right? And across the board, a very sophisticated set of attacks, right? And what research shows, and I'll get into in a second, ultimately the attacks become more sophisticated, but the adversaries don't, right? The amount of tools that are at their disposal on the dark web becomes, and Carnegie Mellon did a study a number of years ago on the uptick, if you will, on the amount of tools that are out there at their disposal, right? So ultimately, the economy becomes pretty significant. So let's play a little Jeopardy. Somebody tell me, what's $148 mean to you in the construct of cybersecurity, cybercrime? Anyone? Any guesses? It's the cost of record per a breach. Cost of a record per record, the cost for a loss, right? So think about the number of citizens you have, the number of students you have, right? Ultimately, the number of records, and if those become lost during an outbreak. 27.9% more likely. You're more likely to suffer breach than to catch the flu. 197 days. Anyone? These are actually from the latest data breach investigation report.
To a length time before it's discovered.
Yeah, that's the mean time to identify, right? And then add to that 69 days. Time to remediate, right? So we're talking about 8 months, the time that an adversary is in our networks before the event that they caused has been remediated, right? And then 7.9 million, right? So let's fast forward a bit. We're now on the other side, right? It's the average cost of a breach, right? These numbers are astronomical. So if we think about our budgets, we think about what we have from an operating budget, you know, the problem space that we are trying to solve is significant. Breaches, right? These are sort of across the board, you know, kind of ironic that Krebs as a cybersecurity blog, right? They were hit. Atlanta, Equifax, Eddie Bauer, Yahoo. There could be any number of these. I could pull up 6, 12, 18 others, right? One of the common themes that really sort of stems across, certainly from an Atlanta perspective. Anybody know how they got into Atlanta? They got into, yes.
Someone's phone and charging or something like that?
It was an RDP port open on a DMZ facing server. They brute forced their way in, and then they leveraged RDP to traverse the network, right? So there's lack of visibility. They suffered from a lack of enterprise visibility across the board. And ultimately, those adversaries were able to get and deploy that payload and then execute the payload 3 weeks into March. So as we look at really sort of the evolution of the threats that are in the landscape. You know, again, I talked about the two Iranian gentlemen, the Sam, but back in the early, you know, turn of, you know, Y2K, those kinds of things, we had to deal with viruses and worms, Trojans, right? Identity theft, and then phishing. Ultimately working our way up until we get into this, you know, Emotet, banking malware, those kinds of things, crypto mining, right? Leveraging our computing resources to ultimately make money. You know, the amount of the bad guys that are doing this, that are performing these functions and ultimately breaching our networks and leveraging all of these various aspects, you know, they are uber diligent. We need to be just as diligent, if not more so. So this is that study I referenced just a second ago. And what Carnegie Mellon found is that the amount of tools, right? So the downward sweeping line is the average intruder's knowledge, right? It's their understanding of your network. It's the understanding of their technical abilities. That upward sweeping line is the complexity and sophistication of the attacks, right? So as time has gone on, the preponderance and availability of all of these tools for these attackers to leverage has become greater, ultimately enabling them to do more damage with less abilities. So from a threat landscape perspective, let's kind of look at those domain areas we talked about. Across the network device applications, user, and data, right? Whether it is in the campus data center, cloud, or Internet of Things, it's pretty dynamic, pretty diverse, the various application, the various endpoint types, right? So how do we solve for that as practitioners, right? Why are we here talking about this today? Well, enter us, right? Enter the vendors, enter the OEM providers, the technology providers. And we're going to let this build, right? And we're going to see out of these probably 15 or so different bubbles, right? You could pick probably one out of the majority of those that we have deployed in your environments, right? That is sort of the premise of Defense in Depth, is that we now ultimately put in place multiple technology solutions, multiple areas to try and fit the various pieces, right? And whether it is endpoint protection, whether it is endpoint or content management, whether it is a network access control solution or privileged account management, endpoint mobility, CASB, firewall, next-gen firewall, SIM, right? You get the picture. How many people have a solution from one of those bubbles, right? How many people have a solution from 2 of those bubbles, 3 of those bubbles, 4 of those bubbles, right? Ultimately, we start to see the complexity therein. So what you end up with is something that sort of looks like this, right? Where you've got, at the core, you've got your enterprise, you've got your organization. So you have an advanced threat detection, you've got an endpoint mobility, you have a SIM, right? You've got all of these various solutions. So we take this approach as part of this defense in depth. Each solution, each piece, each component kind of doing their thing. Oftentimes operating more times than not in a silo, right? So what you end up with is these solutions that are operating, doing their thing, and ultimately until it's a problem, it's not a problem, right? Everybody get that? It's not a problem. We haven't been breached, it's not a problem. But ultimately, it will be when it happens, right? So we end up really in this, tend to be in this false sense of security, we find, right? Because ultimately, everybody that has been breached they have those technologies in place. They have those solutions. Atlanta had multiple solutions, right? Equifax had multiple solutions. Everybody's got multiple solutions as part of this strategy. We've got the firewalls, we've got email filters, right? We've got SIMs, we've got training, and then we've got strategies, we've got frameworks, we've got controls, right? How many of you embrace one of these in your organizations? Anyone? Right? Whether it's NIST 853, whether we operate inside of the energy space, NERC SIP, right? IRS Pub 1075, there's probably a good bit of that. CGIS is probably in there in some way, shape, or form, right? Let's look at one in particular. Let's look at the Cyberkill Chain, right? Developed by Lockheed Martin, and this kind of lays out the approach. They espouse that the adversary, there are multiple steps that an adversary needs to go through in order to successfully implement a breach, right? So this was developed back in 2011. And it describes all of those stages, right? And ultimately, an adversary needs to be successful at every one of these stages in order, needs to achieve success at each one of these stages in order for that breach to ultimately take place, right? In order for them to be successful. Right? So ultimately, what we really look to do, if we can be successful at any one of those, if we can disrupt an adversary's success at any one of those steps, ultimately we flip the paradigm upside down, right? So back to this, we're going to say, you know what, you're not going to be successful every time. All we need to do is be successful once. If we're successful at disrupting the adversary at any one of those steps, at any point throughout that chain, then we're going to ultimately be successful. We're going to stop the breach. We're going to call it stop the damage, right? So we have the Cyberkill Chain, or some derivation thereof, right? We've got a cybersecurity framework, we've got a set of best practices, we've got a set of controls. But how can we best defend ourselves from the adversary? How can we best hold off the attacks, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to be able to, we've got the agents, we've got those firewalls, we've got the training for the employees, right? But all it takes is one individual to click an email that opens a Word document that has a macro-enabled malware delivery mechanism in there, and all of a sudden the device has been owned, right? And then now the adversaries in the network, excuse me, I've got to sneeze one. And once that adversary's in the network, here's an interesting tidbit. Does anybody know how long the adversary was in the City of Atlanta's network prior to the launching of the ransomware? 12 days. They penetrated the network on March 10th, right? The FBI was able to determine that based on forensics. 12 days they stayed in the network unbeknownst to the city, right? So we, in theory, could have adversaries in our networks right now that are doing things because they're not necessarily doing a SQL injection attack that's going to spike some CPU on a server that's going to kick off an alert to SolarWinds, right? Or some database administrator, right? They're not necessarily doing any harm, but they are trying to understand the vulnerable points in the network. They're trying to understand those vulnerable points that they can potentially exploit. So what, right? When we look at really what this is, from an agent-based perspective, at the end of the day, agent-based solutions in and of themselves, and everybody has, how many people have an agent-based technology deployed? I'm going to argue that there's more than one hand in the room, right? Whether it's AV, whether it's a Titanium, whether it's a CrowdStrike or Cylance or a Carbon Black, right? At the end of the day, we have agents that are deployed managing our endpoints. So how do we go about ultimately trying to mitigate those risks? At the end of the day, it really drives down to, excuse me, really drives down to a lack of incomplete discovery, driving to incomplete classification segmentation, leading to an inability to remediate broken systems, right? Remedial actions. So at the end of the day, we think we've got an understanding of our network. We've done vulnerability scanning. We've got our configuration. We've assessed the risks. All of those things were good, but when at the end of the day, we're really not, right? So we take this approach as we talked about, right? Multiple solutions, each doing their job, monitoring their domain area, doing their thing, kind of staying in their swim lane. But what you end up with is something more like this, right? Where those very solutions are in fact still doing their job, but they're broken, right? They're not necessarily able to do that, fill the voids that exist because they are operating again in their swim lanes, right? They are not integrated. They are not able to share contextual information regarding the endpoints, regarding the network, regarding the users, regarding the devices, regarding the posture, right? So you end up kind of in a sense of reality like this. So again, we've got tools, right? We talked about that. We've got people, we've got processes, right? We follow best practices and frameworks. But how best can we really disrupt? What ForeScout talks about is being able to understand complete visibility across your enterprise, right? So what does that mean realistically? It's understanding the moment devices connect, understanding exactly where they are, exactly how they fit into the network, and then being able to take that information and share it across all of the various systems that exist. So all of those tools and all of those pieces of the puzzle that, if you will, that were derived, that are deployed across the network, across the environment, and whether it's the tenables, whether it's the logarithms from a SIM, whether it is the Qualys, the endpoint remediation products, whatever the case may be, ensuring ultimately that you've got complete visibility across your endpoints, across the network, across the users, across the posture, ultimately is really where we start to now connect those dots and we start to strengthen those walls, right? So previously where you had those tools that were not able to do things, you've got Tenable. We sit right next to Tenable out in the exhibit area, right? Tenable is fantastic. It is a wonderful vulnerability scanning solution, but it is a point-in-time scanning solution, right? It is a point in time and it will scan and it's going to do its job, just like a Qualys or Rapid7 or others, right? No solution is going to be perfect, and that's not necessarily, I mean, at the end of the day, there is no one silver bullet across this, but what we sort of talk about here is the ability to sort of, again, connect those dots, fill in those holes and those gaps, strengthen the various pieces of a defense in depth strategy so that we're now able to fill in those gaps. The visibility that I talk about really needs to span those areas, span your campus, right? Span your traditional office building campus environment, span your IoT, right? So inside of this hotel, there's probably hundreds of various IoT devices, whether they are the HVACs, the thermostats, the keys, the key readers on the doors, right? There are probably security cameras, right? Any number of things. Anything at the end of the day that is connected that is not manageable by a traditional mechanism, by an agent or those kinds of things, really sort of fits into that IoT bucket, right? And at the end of the day, as I said in the very beginning, right, the proposition I made is that they ultimately represent part of that attack surface that needs to be protected. Data center, and whether it is your data center, whether it's a colo, whether it's a data center that someone else is providing services out of, again, the need to be able to have visibility into that data center from an endpoint perspective, from a service perspective, from a server perspective is key as well. Cloud, same point there, right? And whether it is Azure, AWS, Google, wherever the case may be, whether it's private, public, hybrid, again, at the end of the day, needing to be able to obtain that visibility into those so that you can now start to fill in those holes and those gaps across those various pieces of the puzzle. And then operational technology. How many in here are from a city? How many are from a county? How many are from a higher ed? right? So city probably has water, sewer, county probably has water, sewer, power, those kinds of things, right? Higher ed's got boilers, has got those kinds of things, right? At the end of the day, operational technology exists in those environments as well, right? Not to mention, from a higher ed perspective, the robotics, those kinds of things that ultimately, at the end of the day, are connected to networks. It's all about understanding and getting full, complete visibility across the entirety of this landscape. But then, once we achieve that visibility, that really sort of just becomes the first step, right? Because that visibility is great, and that's really sort of the first piece in the puzzle. But we need to now take that context and understand how that context can be shared, right? Because it is about users, it is about the devices, it's about where those devices sit on the network, it's about the understanding of those devices and how they interact and communicate with each other across the network, it's about the posture of those devices. All of that information and that intelligence can be shared across this portfolio to allow, right, those various systems, those various technologies to now communicate with each other and ensure that we have closed loop processes in place in order to, when an incident occurs, how do we take action? How do we connect the dots? How do we ensure that a vulnerability is scanned? How do we ensure that a device is remediated? How do I ensure that events are sent to a SIM, that a service desk ticket is open via the SecOps platform in Snow? Those kinds of things, right? So what we end up doing is really ensuring that the communication between these tools, in fact takes place across whatever those tools are, and whether they're the endpoint protection, the endpoint mobility, ultimately ensuring that at the end of the day, we're sharing this contextual information across the board, ultimately with the desired end result of strengthening those walls, right? The defense in depth in and of itself is potentially laden with vulnerabilities, with holes, because of that lack of context, because of that lack of information sharing, because of those potential gaps in communications, right? So ultimately, what we're able to do is by sharing all of that information from a visibility, from a user, from a context perspective, building those walls higher and higher to ultimately close those gaps, close those holes. Okay? Questions, thoughts, concerns? Tell me I'm crazy.
So I had a question on something that you mentioned earlier about the amount of time in the city of Atlanta that the hackers were in there.
Uh-huh.
The FBI was able to tell when they came in. Were they able to identify what they did when they were in there during those 12 days? And is that kind of a common pattern for these bad actors?
Yes and yes. So what they did, and one of the things that I was able to sort of help when we got to ForeScout deployed in the environment as part of the exercise, as part of the IR exercise, was help identify systems that had been touched. So what they ended up doing is when they got into the network, the first thing that they did is when they made their way in is they harvested credentials. So they used a tool called Mimikatz to harvest credentials, right? So they ultimately tried to work their way up to the highest levels of the domain tree to try and gain highest levels of access that they could then use to leapfrog via RDP from system to system, deploying payload. So the first step in the process was harvest credentials, and I've got an entire separate message, a separate deck where I kind of walk through the steps. But what they did is they found vulnerable systems that they could leverage based on those credentials. And then the first step in the process was to put a 0-byte file on those systems that existed, that was literally on the C drive, right? And all that did is identify, after the fact, that they could then go back and deploy the payload to that system, right? So the first step was to go through and figure out, okay, what systems are vulnerable? Can I touch? Can I manipulate? Can I own? And then based on that, they went back through after the fact and deployed the payload. And then, presumably the night of the 21st, in the after hours, they executed, the script executed and kicked off the ransomware policy. And then about 5 or so in the morning, Thursday the 22nd of March, a big red screen popped up, DOS-looking window that said, send us $51,000 Bitcoin and we can give you the decryption key. So that was a fascinating exercise to be a part of. It was truly, I get to talk to customers about all of the great, wonderful things that ForeScout can do, but that was real deal, and I'm sorry this is going to be recorded, no bullshit, opportunity to go in and talk about, like, in an IR exercise, I'm there with the likes of Microsoft and Cisco and SecureWorks, and I saw a SecureWorks guy outside with SecureWorks and Secret Service and FBI, and we were the only thing, because ransomware kills enterprises, and the reason it kills enterprises is it attacks Windows systems, right? Enterprises run on Windows, Active Directory, SCCM, SQL Server, anything running inside a SQL Server. So SyscoWorks, SolarWinds, right? Things that you run your enterprise with from an IT perspective, gone. So it sort of became like an incredibly eye-opening experience for the real value. Good question, thank you. What else? Anybody agree? Anybody disagree? Anybody just want to go to lunch? Make sense? God, you guys are killing me. You're still mine for actually 17 more minutes, so I'm not allowed to leave. They told me I couldn't let you leave.
Talk about Windows and SQL Server. That's the vulnerability. It's Linux, Oracle, and Linux. They're just as vulnerable.
Just as, but from a different perspective, right? And not as they're more difficult. Jazz hands. Got it. Thank you. So from a different perspective, yes, I would agree. And certainly our message to customers is to ensure that you've got complete visibility of those environments as well, of those systems, and to be able to manage and manipulate those. But you have a Linux administrator and a Windows administrator, and the Linux administrator is going to say, I'm not vulnerable. Right, and the Windows administrator is going to try to say that, and you're going to laugh them out the room, right? The preponderance of those very much swings in the Windows direction. That was not an issue for them to that extent, because they attacked Windows, right? That's what the SamSam did, and that's all. At the end of the day, going back to and when I talk about the vulnerability scanning or the patching solutions, those agent-based technologies, right? And truly ensuring and making sure that those systems do their job. It's to alleviate the opportunity for those adversaries to be able to exploit those vulnerabilities, right? If our agent-based solutions are doing the job and we've patched everything, right? That's the first thing. Second thing is to make sure that those that the patching takes place. Third is to ensure that there's next-gen firewalls that should be there to ensure that east-west propagation cannot take place, right? All of those things. But it's ensuring that you're able to gain visibility into what those individual parts are. Because if we're not necessarily talking, another part of that eye-opening exercise that I went through with Atlanta was understanding the various, when your hair's on fire, you're not really necessarily thinking about, you're trying to figure out how to put out the fire, right? But understanding that there's a lot of, you have to sort of set the history aside and the way things were to figure out, okay, now how can I stop the bleeding? How can I plug the dike, right? How can I cauterize the wound? How, whatever metaphor you want to use, you need to be able to figure out how you can harden your exterior, first of all, because they got in. They're probably still in the network. How do you ensure that they can't get in again, because they were getting pummeled, right? Once it hit the news, they were getting peppered because our packet engine was blowing up with North Korea, Iran, Russia, Azerbaijan. Pick an adversarial nation state country for the United States, and they were all hammering, right? So even though the Linux and the Oracles weren't necessarily as much, Windows debilitated them. That was the thing that they suffered from. So, all right, I still have 6 minutes. Really? Nothing? Here we go. I'll guilt you guys into it.
So, with the ForeScout product, it was present in the city of Atlanta before?
That's the second time I've gotten that question. So the city of Atlanta had become a partial customer of ForeScouts. They bought they bought what they could afford, not what they needed. So they bought about a third capacity, right? So in theory, we could see roughly a third of the environment. And what ForeScout does is looks at the inside, right? So the first thing is that they needed to harden their exterior because somebody got in through an internet-facing server. And that's not what we're going to do. But what we were able to do immediately after we got on site was give them an enterprise capacity. So we built out what they should have bought. We built out for them, which was 3 times essentially the capacity. And what that was able to do is give them the information they needed to recover, or at least start the recovery process. Because Cisco came in and was standing up with they brought a 1U server in, set it down on a desk, and we're starting to build up, at a base OS level, build up a new Cisco Works environment. And they had nothing to go on, right? They had no SNMP data because that was in Cisco Works. And oh yeah, by the way, SolarWinds is also gone. And so they went to the network administrator, and she's like, so the first thing, if we had, so the question I got last week from a CIO I was with, they said, well, you were deployed. And I was like, you're correct, right? We were deployed partially. But what we would not have been able to, we would have said, you know what, hey, City of Atlanta, you've got about 3,000 RDP ports open, and you've got this rapid fire succession of RDP connections is trying to be established from system to system to system to system. You probably want to take a look at that, right? Because they had no mechanism to do that because RDP was open. That was part of a GPO that they had pushed out, right? So we would have given them insight into, from an alerting perspective, you've got sessions being established via RDP, leveraging this domain administrator set of credentials. You probably want to take a look at that, right? The second piece would have been giving them, and what we were able to do as part of the IR exercise was give them the information that FBI came up and would tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, what is this IP address? Where is it? Who is logged into it? What switch is it connected to, right? So really from an asset intelligence perspective at the foundational level, because we brought in endpoint data, we brought in user data, we brought in network data, right? We brought in posture data. Once we got fully deployed, we had once we built it out, we then expanded to look at the entire RFC space, and there were devices that were on the network that were not domain, work groups, different IPs, that they had hard-coded in, and it was a nightmare, right? But yeah, no, good catch. We were deployed in a partial capacity, so we weren't able to have the full visibility or even the policy enforcement. Anyone else? Going once? Going twice. Okay, thank you guys.